Hello, and welcome to the Radiant Mission podcast. My name is Rebecca Twomey, and I'm here with my amazing co-host and sister, Rachel Smith.
Hi, everyone.
We are on a mission to encourage and inspire others as they're navigating through this wild life and with their relationship with Christ. Today, we are continuing the conversation on motherhood, and we will be covering all the things related to nursing, breastfeeding, tongue ties, those early days with our new babies. If you are not yet a mom, that's okay. You'll want to listen to this one to get prepared. Also, be sure to send this to your pregnant mom friends because they're going to want to hear this too, whether it's your first time, your third, your fifth, your eighth, I don't know. But Rachel and I are not covering this topic alone because we don't know anything. We actually have an expert here that we're excited to introduce you to. Her name is Sarah Knapek, and she is a certified lactation consultant, and she's known as an IBCLC, which stands for International Board Certified Lactation Consultant. And you can find her on fortheloveoflactation.com or on Instagram at fortheloveoflactation with an underscore at the end. She also has an incredible blog and Instagram all about motherhood and homemaking called Home with Joni that I love. So Sarah, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. This is so fun, and I am just so grateful that y'all are giving me the opportunity to share my knowledge about breastfeeding with the world. I don't know who's listening to this, so we can assume the world. I love just educating and empowering women, moms to be, moms that, like you said, if it's their eighth kid, every baby's different. So
Absolutely.
this is going to be great. So I'm excited. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. And I have a fun fact for everybody. So Sarah is 18 weeks pregnant, as am I. We are due 2 days apart from each other. And this is also both of our third babies. And Rachel is also pregnant with her third. So we have, for the first time ever, 3 pregnant women on this podcast at the same time that are also pregnant with their third babies. It's kind of crazy.
A lot of hormones going on.
Yes.
Yes, a lot of hormones. We're doing this at night, so hopefully all of us can stay awake to the end.
It's the middle of the day where I crash.
Exactly, right? The between noon and 3 p.m. lull that we have as pregnant women.
Yep.
Yeah.
Nap time yep.
I feel you. Well, let's start, Sarah. I would love for you to just tell us your story. What inspired you to become a lactation consultant?
Okay, I'm excited to share all about this, especially if you've ever considered, if you're listening in and if you've have a passion for breastfeeding and you want to explore this journey as well. Hopefully my story will inspire you that you can do this too. So I actually went to college for elementary education. So I was an elementary school teacher when I graduated college, and I taught first grade, I've taught fifth grade, fourth grade. By the end of that third year, I realized that I love teaching, but I did not love everything surrounding the public school system, if you catch my drift.
Yeah.
All of the politics that are involved in the school system. I felt like I did not have the freedom to teach. Everything had to be by the standards, and you're teaching to the test. And it reached a point where I just felt like I wasn't enjoying what I was doing anymore. And it was really sad because I loved the children. That's why I was doing it. But I felt very trapped. So at the end of my third year teaching, I was pregnant with my first daughter. And so she was due in the beginning of April. So we knew that I was going to go on maternity leave and just not come back in the fall. And my plan was I'm just going to be a stay-at-home mom, and that's going to be my new job. And I was, really looking forward to it, and excited for the change. And after my daughter was born, we encountered all of the breastfeeding struggles, like every single thing that you can possibly imagine. And I, you know, I was a teacher, so I like to study up, kind of know what to expect about things. Like me and my husband went to the birthing class, we went to the breastfeeding class at the hospital. Like we thought we were like prepared. We're like, we've done our homework, we've got this.
Mm-hmm.
So as soon as she's born and we can't get her to latch at the hospital and she's just screaming and screaming and screaming and no one's coming to help us. And those that were coming were just kind of like, oh, try this, and nothing was working.
Mm-hmm.
It felt defeating.
Mm-hmm.
Before we left the hospital, I remember they came in with a bottle of formula and basically poured it down her throat. She guzzled the entire thing and passed out afterwards and was like the most content I had seen her in the 2 days since she had been born. And I remember just sitting in that bed, bawling,
Oh.
sobbing, because all of those emotions,
Mm.
as it doesn't matter if it's your first or third time being a mom, if, I really wanted to make breastfeeding work. That was something that I was really determined to do. And the fact that I felt like my body was failing her,
Mm-hmm.
and then she just like is happily drinking this formula. I'm over here just like the hormones were getting to me where I'm like, okay, this is obviously a me problem. I don't know why I can't do this. She doesn't want me. And I was just a mess. I was sobbing. And so after that, we came home from the hospital. She was still really struggling to latch. Another thing they did at the hospital was hand me a nipple shield, which I don't know if you're familiar with those nipple shields. They're kind of like, if you haven't seen one before, they're like a silicone, basically exactly what it sounds like, a shield that goes over your nipple and it just kind of helps protect it as like a barrier. And sometimes babies can latch a little bit easier onto them, since they're a little bit bigger, more easier for them to grip.
Mm-hmm.
So they just kind of threw one at me, didn't really tell me like what it was for. And we're just kind of like, here, this may help.
Mm-hmm.
And I left with that. And the nipple shield was my saving grace for a little bit while we were at home. And around after like the first week or so, I was I was still struggling. I was in tears almost every day. She would struggle to latch onto the shield every now and then. And she would just scream. I feel like we could never ever get her to just be like calm and like a happy baby.
Mm-hmm.
And then my nipples started to hurt really bad. I started getting what I now know is called vasospasms, which is basically like, if you feel, I don't know if you guys are familiar with what those are, but it's basically like a really cold feeling that's like, it's like a shocking cold feeling. Like
Okay.
if you were walking through like the freezer section and had like in the grocery store and then like put your hand inside like one of the freezer doors, that's kind of like what my nipples would feel like all the time.
Wow. Oh,
So
that's
it is,
crazy.
yes. And it was just like this burning cold sensation that wouldn't go away. I would feel it even if she wasn't latched.
Mm-hmm.
And I just knew something was wrong. My husband was so, so supportive. I thank him to this day for getting me to where I am now, because if
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't for his support, I wouldn't be doing this.
Mm-hmm.
But he was the one that was like, I really know that you want breastfeeding to work and I really want our daughter to have breast milk. So let's call a lactation consultant, see if somebody can come to the house and help you out. At
Mm-hmm.
this point, I was probably like 10 days postpartum or so and still just in the thick of it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had an IBCLC come to the house. And, you know, she was really helpful at the time. She helped me just kind of feel more confident in latching her. Um, some tips and tricks for getting her to latch that I had never been shown before,
Mhm.
and did a weighted feed for me. So she would weigh her on the scale before and after, so I would
Hmm.
know exactly how much milk she was transferring while breastfeeding,
Oh, that's
which,
interesting. I haven't heard of that before.
yes.
I
And
did
so
that
I'll,
too. Did
yeah.
you?
And
I
so,
Yeah, yeah.
I haven't heard of that. Oh, that's interesting. I always wondered
and
how you would know how much milk they get.
Yeah, because
yes.
they'll be like 3 ounces heavier.
Okay.
Yep.
Well, makes sense.
It it's really cool. I have my scale somewhere out there too in the room.
Is
I
it a
bring it to
baby?
every client's house.
Do you use a baby scale or a fish scale?
It's a baby scale. So they're, they're very expensive.
Okay.
Probably one of the biggest startup costs for my business was
Mhm.
this baby scale, and it's like it's literally my baby. I have to bring it to every single consult, and I have this special backpack for it and everything.
Mhm.
So, anyways, getting back to my story, the weighted feed was very helpful. I knew she was transferring enough, but it didn't solve the problem of how come I can't latch her without this nipple shield,
Mhm.
without being in excruciating pain? What
Mhm.
is going on? And the lactation consultant was like, you know, it sounds like the vasospasms. Um, and I think it's probably just due to you had a little bit of a shallow latch. Now that we fixed the latch, hopefully just having that new latch for a little while is going to help clear that up. And then you can wean off the nipple shield. And so she left, and I was feeling like, okay, this is going to get better. It's only going
Mhm.
to go up from here.
Mhm.
So probably around the 2.5 month mark. So we had made it 2.5 months breastfeeding. I was super excited about that. All of a sudden, she started rejecting the nipple shield. And that had been like the only way I had been
Mhm.
able to breastfeed up until this point.
Mhm.
Um, would not breastfeed without it. The pain had luckily subsided, but only with the shield. If I tried to use to breastfeed without it, there was not a chance. And so all of a sudden, she started arching her back, screaming and crying. Just I couldn't get her to latch at all.
Mhm.
So then what happened? We started. It basically became she would throw that whole fit trying to latch. It wouldn't work. I would have to then go pump milk, give it to her in a bottle,
Oh man.
and it was exhausting because you're
Mhm.
triple feeding at that point. It was just taking forever. And
Mhm.
I'm like, something just does not feel right.
Mhm.
And so it was at that point that I was like, you know what? I'm going to take matters into my own hands at this point.
Mhm.
And I started just researching like crazy on mom forums. Google was my best friend. And I'm like, what does it mean if my baby is refusing the breast, arching, screaming, is super gassy? Like, what in the world is happening?
Mhm.
Um, and there was one thing that showed up that mentioned tongue ties.
Mhm.
And I was like, you know what? She has all of these symptoms that it's listing right here, but no one has ever once brought this up to me. Like,
Mhm.
what in the world is a tongue tie? I
Mhm.
had not a clue. I had lactation consultants in the hospital look at her, never said a thing. I had an IBCLC at my house, never mentioned a thing. And I decided to call the pediatric dentist in town who specializes in the tongue ties for an assessment. And I
Mhm.
took her.
Okay.
When we were there, um, she did the assessment. And the way that ties work, for lip and tongue, they're on a scale of stage 1 all the way to 4. And so 4 is kind of considered the most tied,
Mhm.
it's like very, very tight.
Okay.
So when she did the assessment, my daughter had stage 4 lip ties,
Wow. My
stage 4
gosh.
posterior tongue ties, and 2 buccal ties, which are the cheek
The
ties.
cheek ties. Oh my
And
gosh.
she had a super, super high palate, which we can get into later about kind of just how important like palate posture is and everything with breastfeeding. Um, and I remember just looking at my husband and I broke down. I said, I knew something else
Something
was
was
going
wrong.
on.
Yeah.
Something was wrong. And no one was going to advocate for anything if it wasn't for me.
Right.
Like, I mean, it's going to bring me to tears even talking about it right now because it was such a, like, I just couldn't believe it that it had been missed by everyone. No one was even going to care to bring it up. And I asked my husband, I'm like, can we like get this procedure done? Cause they asked me if they could do it. They were like, we'll do it same day. And they do like the laser procedure. They said it was really quick. She can breastfeed right after. And my husband knew like how important it was for me at this point to make breastfeeding work. And he knew how miserable I was and how it was giving me such postpartum depression just from not being able to figure this out. So he's like, okay, let's do it. So we went ahead with the procedure. And now this isn't the case for everyone after the procedure's done, but within 24 hours, her gassiness completely disappeared. Any silent reflux the pediatrician thought she had vanished. She started latching without a nipple shield with zero pain, like within those 24 hours. And I could not believe it. And I'll try to shorten this a little bit more because I know my story can be very long. But she went on to breastfeed until she was 22 months old.
Awesome. Great.
When I was pregnant with my second daughter. And at that point, it was when I was pregnant with my second daughter and was still like a stay-at-home mom and kind of feeling like that void of I love being a mom, but I miss working. Like I miss kind of feeling like I want that other purpose that I had like when teaching. That it was my husband yet again who said, Sarah, why don't you look into becoming a lactation consultant because you're still so passionate about breastfeeding since you've been breastfeeding Joni for so long and you love telling everybody about your story. And I think that you would be really good at it. You could use your teaching background and really just educate these moms about breastfeeding and help them out. And I said, oh my goodness, that sounds incredible. So I started doing the research and trying to make it happen. And looked into it and then started to do all of the online courses. So I started like right when COVID started, of course. So it was like right in like March 2020. And so everything was like virtual at that point. And so I ended up doing the entire program. It took me about a year and a half. So I found out that I passed my IBCLC exam in December 2021. So yeah, about a year and a half total to do that. And I managed to do that program online, taking care of a toddler while pregnant and then studying for boards with a newborn. And it is one of my biggest accomplishments in life. The fact that I get to do this now and help moms, it has been the biggest blessing. So I have no healthcare background. I'm not a nurse. And you sometimes will hear like, oh, if you want to be an IBCLC, you have to have that healthcare background, and you don't. There are certain like prerequisites that you have to take in order to start the program. And I was just able to take like those few courses online, like human anatomy and physiology, things like that, that I could just take those courses. I didn't have to have a nursing degree.
Sure.
So
those sound really fascinating as us home birth moms. That sounds like a great class to take, anatomy.
Yes. So yeah, that's kind of my story. I know it's kind of a longer one, but I feel like it needs to be that long because that's what got me.
Not at all.
You know?
No, you gave us the full gamut, and I think a lot of women are going to relate to this story because I know Rachel and I both can. There
Yeah,
were
that's what
cases.
I was gonna say. Like, so much of what you said resonated with me because I had like a nightmare of a time breastfeeding my first for like so many similarities that you had. But the unfortunate thing, this was 7 years ago, is nobody ever said the word tongue tie to me.
Mhm.
So I never like, I've always wondered if
Mhm.
that's why it was so hard for us. And his main issue was he wouldn't gain weight, and he like was then falling off the charts and failure to thrive, and I'm nursing like every hour on the hour, so it's like I can't possibly be nursing more. Why isn't this baby gaining weight? And so yeah, everything you said is just so relatable as moms, because breastfeeding is natural. A lot of us go into it thinking,
Mhm.
oh, like it's just going to come natural, but it can be really difficult. Like when things come up, knowing the right people to go to, because I went to a ton of different lactation consultants too, like the hospital ones, and then one like at a clinic, and they did help, but it was kind of the same with you. Like they helped me like get through the time, but it was like, what was the root cause? We never
Right.
really found it.
Mhm.
And but I did make it exclusively breastfeeding him for 8 months, and then I got thrush.
With
And
me.
I got thrush and something like blisters or something at the same
Oh
time. Like
goodness.
I could not latch, it was
Oh,
so painful.
that sounds super
Yeah.
painful.
And so I had friends around me that gave me milk, and I couldn't pump enough, and so I gave him formula for the first time at that age, and he slept through the night for the first time
Yep.
and gained a pound in like a week. And I was like, you know what? I'm done here.
Yes.
So I ended up doing both, nursing as much as I could and supplementing with formula after that, because it just was never the same. Also not, having to heal. So anyways, I think these resources that you kind of described that you learned about through your story are incredibly helpful, because it was the same when I had my second. I
Mhm.
had issues again. I also had 2 C-sections though, and I have a feeling that played a lot in
Yeah.
like hormones that affected. But I have always said, like, when I have a third, whether the midwife, the lactation consultant, anybody says it or not,
Mhm.
I'm bringing this baby to a pediatric dentist that specializes
Yes.
in ties. Like, I just want to hear it from the horse's mouth that either this baby has a perfect mouth or doesn't.
Yeah, it definitely. I think you're onto something really important there, Rachel, too, that a lot of women may not they may be onto it or may not, but I think it's a good point in that when you go through the experience of having a physiological birth, naturally that's not augmented or with a C-section, or there aren't sometimes different drugs can play different roles, but especially with C-sections, it does end up for a lot of women leading to breastfeeding issues. And so you're not alone. You're not the only one that's going through that sometimes that can play a big role, but there are all these other factors too, right?
Right.
I learned
Yes.
about the tongue tie thing the second time. And thank
Yep.
God I had an amazing doula who he was born, and within minutes she's looking at him. She's like, he has a tongue and a lip tie. Immediately knew. I mean, he
Which is
just
incredible.
came out of the
The fact
womb,
that she pointed that out. Yeah.
and she knew immediately. And what was so funny, and I told you this, Sarah, when we were talking, that when I started looking into it, there was a list of like all the things, just like you Googled. I was Googling
Yep.
and it was like the list of all the things that indicated tongue tie. And as I'm going
Yep.
through the list, I'm going, oh my God, Brooke had tongue tie.
Yeah.
And I never knew. No one ever said anything to me. And she was, what, 2.5 at this point?
Yep.
Not breastfeeding anymore, so it didn't matter. But when I first started breastfeeding Brooke, I had a lot of pain. She did breastfeed, and we went just like you did until 23 months, but she had clicking. She would
Yep.
click sometimes when she would breastfeed, which was on that list. And I was excruciating the first 3 weeks and went through all these things, and she ended up doing fine. But I didn't know anything back then. Nobody said anything to
Right.
me. Just like you said,
No one.
I probably saw 6 lactation consultants at the hospital. I was there forever.
Yeah.
It
And no
really
one
is.
says a single thing.
Yeah.
And you know, if we're on the topic of ties now, I don't know if we've transitioned
Yeah,
to
let's
that
talk
part or
about
not.
all the things: tongue, lip, cheek
But
ties. This is something that's missed.
it
So,
sounds like we've kind of just transitioned into that.
yeah.
But I don't know if y'all are aware of this, but pediatricians have zero formal training on ties whatsoever.
Mm.
And as moms, and you have, you know, especially new moms, you trust your pediatrician as the person who's going to be able to take care of your baby when you think there's a problem going on. And in my experience dealing with majority of pediatricians, um, they are very, very quick to dismiss any kind of tie as long as baby is gaining weight. And if they see that, they're like, oh, well, your baby's gaining weight just fine. Like, there's no ties. If there was ties, like, your baby wouldn't be gaining weight. Or they think ties are, you know, just like an old wives' tale, or just like a bunch of crockahooey. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah,
But
definitely.
just like don't believe in them. And I'm like,
Mhm.
as a medical professional, how do you just not believe in something? Like, no.
Yeah, how do
Like,
you not believe in something that you can see with your actual eyeballs too?
Right.
yes. So kind of getting into that too with like the different stages of them. So
Mhm,
some of them are more obvious to see than others.
mhm.
So the stage 1 and sometimes the stage 2 ones are what we call the anterior ties, and those are the ones that are like connected to the tip of the tongue or pretty close
Yeah,
to the tip
so
of the tongue.
what
So
you're
yeah,
talking
those,
about, Sarah, is it's called the
yep,
frenulum,
the
correct?
frenulum underneath the tongue.
Which
Yes.
is the
Yep.
little thin, how would you describe it?
Little
Little thin
thin stringy thing that
stringy
connects
thing
the tongue
underneath
to
your
the floor
tongue
of the
that
mouth. Yep.
connects your tongue to the floor of your mouth, and it's posterior if it's towards the front, and
So
anterior if it's to the back,
anterior if it's in the front.
if it's in the front.
And so
Okay.
that's kind of what's considered like stage 1 or stage 2. And
Okay.
then there's posterior where if it's connected near the back. And so
Oh,
everyone is,
I just learned something
yep.
new about
And
Ben's.
so with
Ben's was
posterior,
anterior then, because his was all the way at the tip of his tongue.
okay. So yeah, the anterior ones are the easiest to spot. So those are the ones that even most times, like the pediatricians will be like, okay, yeah, I see the tongue tie.
Okay.
It's ones that are posterior that are very, very tricky to spot because sometimes they're even submucosal, which means they're underneath the tissue. So
Mm,
they're far back at the way back of the tongue, and it's kind of like underneath the tongue tissue.
okay.
So you can barely even see the frenulum sometimes. And
Mhm,
so in those cases it just gets completely dismissed because, oh, we don't see a frenulum at all, there's no tongue tie.
mm,
And it's just so far back. What that really does is it prevents the baby from lifting their tongue all the way, so they end up using compensations because they can't lift the back of their tongue, it's
mhm.
tethered down. So they use compensations, and they'll either hold on to the breast with their lips. So if you've ever seen babies with lip blisters or
Mm.
two-toned lips, where after a nursing session you'll see kind of like the inner part of their lips kind of a little bit like pink and puffier.
That happened
Then
with my first. His lips
okay.
were completely blistered. And I didn't even mention like what was really hell about breastfeeding him. And the first week, I mean, not to be dramatic, but I'm pretty dramatic, is he essentially
Be
like
dramatic.
sucked my nipples right off. Like
Okay.
they were like, what is it called? I guess raw, but it was like
Yeah.
the tips of them were gone and they were just
Oh my
bleeding
goodness.
and
Oh
his
my
lips
goodness.
were blistered.
Yes. These are classic. These are signs that there was probably a tie going on.
Okay. Well, 7
Probably.
years later, good to know.
Good to know. It's always good to know.
Right.
I could get into how my husband's been diagnosed with tongue tie now, and he's
That's right.
33. So that's a really fun story to get into later if there's time.
Uh,
And so babies will compensate. They want to get that milk, and their just poor mouths aren't able to efficiently get that milk. So they're going to try any other means possible to get it. So if that means they have to hold on to that breast tissue with their lips instead of their tongue and try and get the milk out that way, that's what they're going to do. And that's what's causing that rawness and that pain when breastfeeding.
Mm.
And so I see that a lot with clients. Another thing too is kind of like that chomping. So what the tongue is supposed to do is do kind of like a wave-like motion. So the nipple will be against the roof of the mouth, and the tongue lifts up to wrap around it, kind of in like a taco shape, and then it does the wave-like motions to extract the milk. And so if the tongue can't do that and can't lift up all the way, the baby sometimes is just gonna like a shark just chomp at the breast and try and get that milk out. And
Mhm.
that's another thing that's going to cause a lot of pain. And so that's something that you could even check with your own baby by looking at their chin when they're feeding. So if the chin is just going up down up down up down, that's kind of chompy. But if
Mm.
you can see right underneath their chin, it kind of makes this little wave motion, then
Mm.
you know that their tongue is doing what it's supposed to be doing. So there's a lot of different things to look for, because tongue ties can just get very, very tricky in diagnosing, because there's not really a universal way that has been determined of diagnosing tongue ties.
Mm.
Um, so even me as an IBCLC, we were told in our training and everything, and it's part of our certification, I am not allowed to diagnose a tongue tie. I'm not
Mm.
allowed to. I can only basically like refer and suspect that there is a
Mhm.
tongue tie to
Okay.
then the pediatric dentist. And
Mm.
so, I try and tell these moms, like, I highly suggest you go get it checked out because I
Mhm.
really suspect it, but I can't diagnose it. And I wish I was able to,
Mhm.
but I've been really passionate about doing as many trainings and learning as much as I can about ties to really be able to help my clients make that decision on whether to go be seen or not.
Mhm.
Um,
It
there's
kind
a
of sounds
full
like in this stage of the world in
Yeah,
2023, everybody should probably just go get this done. With like,
I
go get it checked
100
out.
yes. If in a perfect world, there would be, most moms, like, I wish there was more home births and more natural births and everything, but, you
Mhm.
know, there's most moms give birth in a hospital
Mhm.
where this care is not provided and the moms are just sent home. And in my perfect world, I feel like there would be a pediatric dentist on staff
Mhm.
who could do assessments and laser revisions, because they take 3 minutes, and teach the aftercare before mom gets sent home from the hospital.
Right.
I think that would alleviate so many breastfeeding issues. It would be unreal. The breastfeeding rates, I feel like, would seriously skyrocket,
Mm.
because moms just aren't told about it or given the tools. They're just kind of sent home. And then once their milk transitions to mature milk, that 3 to 5 days postpartum, they're home from the hospital. And then that's when issues are starting, and then they have
Yeah.
no help. And
Yeah.
so that's
Yeah.
really that's the biggest problem
Yeah.
Yeah. It's really
that I'm seeing.
crazy that, especially for, first time new moms giving birth in the hospital, that you're just like kind of kicked out, like, good luck
Yeah.
with everything. And that's how I felt as a first time mom, that I'm recovering from a C-section, and I was having a terrible time breastfeeding in the hospital. Then day 3 or 4 hit and my milk came in, and I'm like, "Oh, this is totally different now." And I had
Yeah.
no resources, no help. I remember being on the phone at like 1 o'clock in the morning with someone who just ran the local Latch League
Yeah.
chapter. She
Mhm.
just was like a volunteer and like called me to help me. And I was crying because I'm like, I can't do this. I don't know what to do. And I walked myself back in the hospital like 5 days later, and they normally wouldn't see you again once you leave, the lactation
Right.
consultants there. I'm like, "You have to help me. Like, I'm not leaving here until you help me latch this baby again." And they did help me, but it just felt like so terrible that you just get sent on your way without anyone there to help you with it.
Yeah.
Right. So
This is definitely a good transition to us talking about the hospital. But before we do,
yes.
hospital consultants, I wanted to ask Sarah about cheek ties and the lip tie because we've talked about
Okay.
tongue,
Yep.
but do cheek and lip also cause breastfeeding problems?
So this is something that I hear about a lot. I feel like the lip tie is something that is noticed quicker and easier than the
Sure.
tongue tie because
Okay.
it's a lot easier to lift up a baby's lip. If you've
Hmm.
ever tried to put your finger underneath a baby's tongue, it takes a lot of training to figure out how to do so because they're very wiggly and it can be a little scary to do that. With the lip ties, what you're really looking for too is that same frenulum. And so if you take two hands and you lift that baby's lip out and up, that lip should be able to reach the tip of the baby's nose.
Hmm.
And when you look at that frenulum, you want it to remain pink. What you don't want to see is any blanching occur. And blanching is when that skin is being pulled tight and it makes it turn white. So
Hmm.
it's basically like that tension that happens. So if
Okay.
you are pulling the lip up to the nose and you see any part of that frenulum turning white or the gums turning white, that's indicating that tension. And
Okay.
so those are red flags for me that there's a lip restriction of some type going on. Now, if
Okay.
you see that frenulum and it goes really far down to the gum line, then that's considered more of like that class 4 of a lip tie, because that frenulum is then really restricting if it's going down and going underneath that gum line. And that's the kind of thing that can sometimes cause, like when babies' teeth grow in, have like a gap between teeth, things like that can be like a sign of a lip tie.
Hmm.
And so with as far as breastfeeding is concerned, when baby's feeding, you want that upper lip to be kind of flanged out a little bit like a fish,
Hmm.
but it doesn't have to be super flanged out. What I really look for is we don't want the top lip to be tucked under at all. We want to be able to see some of the pink part of the lip. And
Hmm.
that's always key because I'll see some moms and they try to stick their finger up there and really get it flanged out like a fish. And I go, it's not really necessary to do that. We just want to be able to see some of the pink part.
Okay.
And so the lip ties are really important when it comes to, I think, teeth development,
Mm.
not so much in regards to the latch because the
Okay.
tongue is really what's doing the majority of the work when
Hmm.
it comes to latching.
Hmm.
That tongue has to be able to lift, um, and reach the nipple at at a comfortable level, and kind of getting into like the palate too, why like a high palate can be an issue. um, so if the palate is really, really high, and that forms in utero. So the tongue at rest should always be resting at the roof of the mouth. And that helps shape the palate to kind of be rounded instead of being what we call like a bubble, where if I put my finger up there in the baby's mouth and it kind of gets like lost in the abyss, as I call it, then their palate's super high. So their tongue is going to have trouble lifting all the way up to where the nipple is at the roof of the mouth
Hmm.
to effectively latch, because that's going to be really far away if like the palate is super high up like that. And the reason that it won't form as like rounded as it needs to is because the tongue is tethered underneath, and so at rest it won't sit at the roof of the mouth because
Hmm.
it's kind of stuck at the bottom. Does this make
Okay.
sense? it's a
Totally.
very it's a
How it
complicated subject.
how is a palette then, like, addressed if it is a really high palette?
Yes. So if it is a high palate, like, and a baby is getting revisions done and everything and ends up going with a laser revision for tongue tie, naturally, since the baby's so young, doesn't have teeth yet, then once the tongue tie is released, the tongue should then rest against the roof of the mouth, which
Okay.
you can check when the baby is sleeping. And I have ways to kind of show that as well. And then that is what is going to help shape the palate, and then just proper breastfeeding at that point,
Okay.
because everything's going to lay where it should be. Um, and it's such an important thing to have like the correct shape posture, because like the palate posture and everything, because if you don't get it corrected as like a baby, once you have teeth grow in, then it can become so much harder to expand the palate. And that's when like palate expanders come into play, when
Right.
teeth start coming in and teeth get crowded, things like that. So another one of the reasons that I feel it's so beneficial to get them addressed when they're babies, and not wait until they're older.
Hmm.
Like my husband right now, I mentioned this earlier.
Yeah.
I I took him to the pediatric dentist to get assessed as well, because he has dealt with, chronic sleep apnea, high blood pressure, um, just things that are concerning of somebody of his age. And they can be related to something like a tongue tie issue, as crazy as that sounds. And so when he got assessed, he has a super high palate. And because of that, and he has a tongue tie. The combination of those things are contributing to his sleep apnea. And it's not easy to get fixed as an adult. So she couldn't just go in and laser it and call it a day,
Hmm.
because his palate has been formed. His teeth are all in. Nothing's going to easily change.
Hmm.
So he would have to wear this palate expander for around 2 years,
Mm.
where
Wow.
it would shift some of his teeth around. Then he would have to go through myofascial release therapy, which is basically like physical therapy for the tongue, and helping retrain it how to move in the proper way before the release is even done. So that way, that muscle memory is starting to form. Then have a release, and then continue that therapy afterwards. So the
Wow.
whole process in all would take probably close to 3 years in order for his ties to be released. And it's something we're definitely exploring, but it's obviously a huge commitment to do that.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I use his story of what's going on with him right now as, like, just to inspire others to be like, get this checked as a baby while you can, so
Hmm.
you don't end up like
Yeah.
my husband.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I had one more question about ties.
Yeah.
Do you have you looked into like how this stuff could be affected like in utero, like the press Weston A. Price, who was a dentist, like his research? Like, do you know much about that?
I know a little bit. So I've looked into it slightly. There's like some gene that may be responsible for it. I'm not well versed in it, so I don't want to go into it. Um, but there's a few things that I've said about like folic acid, and
Mhm.
how not taking that in pregnancy can help prevent ties, that the folic acid can help contribute to the ties forming through like taking of the prenatals and things like that. So I've heard things of that nature, but I don't think anything has ever been like determined as
Yeah.
taking folic acid is causing tongue ties. Like nothing's
Yeah.
been.
So you mean
It's
like
all
the
just
difference between
speculation.
folate and folic acid, because folic acid is what is in a prenatal, but folate is really what is recommended. But the
That's
only
from
way to
plant.
get enough folate is to eat like 7 pounds of spinach.
Right. Which is
And
not
so
going to
we
happen.
take folic acid, and there's potentially could be contributing to tongue ties. But I think Weston A. Price's thing, Ray, is more, his theory is more about the modern day diet of us today, that we eat a lot of breads and refined sugars, and we're not eating the same way that our ancestors ate. And that could be contributing to these shifts in our palates and things like that, which in a lot of ways would make sense because a lot of us that were born in the, you know, 80s and 90s and beyond are the ones that we're seeing these big palate issues with and these tongue ties and stuff like that. You know, it seems
Yeah.
like it
Yeah.
started maybe late 70s to today that it's becoming more popular, or maybe people just didn't notice it back then.
Yeah,
Well,
so I have a little bit that I know about the background of this, not exactly how they would form in utero, but just kind of
Mm,
like why people are talking more about them today and how come
okay.
all of a sudden we're seeing like tongue tie, tongue you have a tongue tie, you have a tongue tie, like that kind of thing. So, um I've looked into the history of it and everything, and apparently midwives, back when home births were more mainstream and everything, and that's just what everyone was doing. So midwives would actually keep one fingernail. This is barbaric, okay?
Oh no,
So
I'm
midwives,
scared.
yes, they would keep one fingernail extremely long, and after a baby was born, they would cut the tongue tie with this fingernail. But they
Oh.
were actually looking for it.
Mm,
And then down the road, then we have hospitals, then we have modern medicine, and then everything kind of shifted away from those home births and midwives to now we're at hospitals with doctors, things like that.
mhm,
And it fell out of practice.
mm,
And no one was talking about it. No one was checking for tongue ties anymore at that point.
mm,
And then the introduction of formula became a huge thing, right? And
mm.
so once that happened, um, if somebody couldn't breastfeed, they were just given formula. There was
Yeah.
no
Don't look for it,
trying
just here, supplement.
there was no trying to figure out what was actually going on that was making breastfeeding difficult, because any baby, even a tongue-tied baby, can drink milk from a bottle because they're not having the the milk just flows out of the nipple into the baby's mouth.
Yeah, it just
Like
right.
comes out by
they
itself.
it just comes out. Where with breastfeeding, baby actually has to work for it and it uses
Mhm,
totally different tongue muscles than with a
mhm,
bottle. So, all that being said, formula was considered like better than breastfeeding in that day and age and everything.
mhm,
When like our parents were born and everything.
mhm.
Um and even like when we were born, I know I was formula fed because my mom was, she struggled with breastfeeding. And so she just gave me formula because that was the thing to do.
Mhm.
And nobody was questioning anything. And so it hasn't been until kind of like recent times where we're starting to see breastfeeding numbers start to increase
Mm,
and people are wanting to breastfeed more,
mhm.
that they're starting to question why breastfeeding is difficult when they're running into issues. And now that's why we're seeing kind of like this increase in tongue ties recently, is because people are actually looking for them again.
Sure, they're
Yeah.
looking
So
for them.
it's like they've
Yeah,
always been there, but they
yeah,
just were
Okay.
avoided for
yes,
so long.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's
Yep.
funny
Okay.
that you say the different muscles. There's this sweet old guy that owns this, Italian restaurant by us, and we were in there one day, and he just always goes he talks to every table, and he loves babies, and he was talking to Ben, and he's like, "He's a breastfed baby, isn't he?" And I'm like, "Yes, he is." And he said, "I can always tell a breastfed baby because they have strong cheeks." He's like, "Their cheeks are, like, strong." And I thought that was really funny that he knew that, first of all, that he was like, Good job, mom, like, keep doing it." He was
Oh,
very
that's awesome.
encouraging.
Yeah.
But that reminds me, the cheeks, because that's kind of the last part of the, tongue, lip, and then cheeks. I don't know anything about cheek ties. Do they
Yep.
cause problems with breastfeeding, or are they more teeth and palate related, or how do they factor in?
They're a little bit more teeth and palate related.
Okay.
When I do oral assessments on babies, and that's something that I can very obviously feel are like tighter on some babies than others. It basically just kind of like restricts them from opening their mouths as wide as they
I see.
need to be able to when latching. That's probably the biggest thing that they contribute to. Because if it's tight right here on the sides of your lips and you're trying to open your mouth, flange your lips,
Yeah.
and try and fit as much breast tissue into your mouth as possible, anything that's tight and restrictive is going to hinder that. And so that's
gonna
kind
cause a
of what
problem.
the cheek ties play a role in. But it's something that not even every pediatric dentist will address that's trained in ties. It's kind of becoming like a newer thing as well, kind of in the tie world.
Okay.
So it's not something that like would necessarily need to be addressed. The pediatric dentist that I work really closely with who does the ties, she will only do cheek ties if it's like extremely tight. She's
Okay.
not going to mess with it and do anything unnecessarily if she's
Okay.
like, no, because everyone's going to have something there. They're going to have those little frenulums, but as long as they're not super restrictive, there's no need to do anything. Yeah.
Cool. Well, as we wrap the conversation on ties, I wanted to
Okay.
remind folks of what you had mentioned, that when there are tongue ties and lip ties more specifically, and sometimes the cheek, you can go to a pediatric dentist who can do laser revision. Some places will do manual revision where they clip it. And then you and
Yes.
I were talking about, I took Ben to the chiropractor when he was 2 days
Yes.
old and knew he had tongue ties. And we decided to try cranial spatial therapy first before clipping the
Yes.
ties because I wasn't having a problem breastfeeding with him. And so what that is basically this release technique that a chiropractor is doing to help the baby release the muscles in their back and shoulders, which impacts their mouth
Yes.
naturally. And so Ben's lip tie released when he was maybe 2 months old, somewhere between, maybe it was 8 weeks or something like that. I guess that is 2 months, between 6 and 8 weeks. And then his tongue released when he was 3 months old. Mike looked over one day and he had his mouth open and his tongue was up and it had naturally just split, like it just
But
broke on its own. We had
what?
noticed over a couple of days it was getting thinner and thinner and thinner. It looked like it was going to break. And so that was pretty cool for us. I do still think he has a bit of a lip tie that I still may need to get addressed. And I notice it because he has a gap between his front two teeth. So, it's just, I want to throw out there all the options to people. I think those are the only options, right? Is there anything else?
Those are pretty much the best options. I always recommend chiropractic care and craniosacral therapy, like you were saying, in conjunction with any tie release.
Yeah.
So I never even send clients just to go get a release without doing the prep work beforehand.
Mhm.
Where, like you were saying, with the craniosacral therapy, just helping to release the tension in those muscles before even doing the procedure and then
Mhm.
continuing it afterwards. And then sometimes, I run into clients fairly often who it's a scary thing when you're a new mom dealing with hormones and someone's coming to tell you, "Oh, I think your baby is tied and needs to have a laser procedure done at this early." I mean, what? No
Yeah.
one wants to hear that as a new
Yeah.
mom. And so I always tell moms, like, start with the chiropractic care if you're on the fence about it. See
Mhm.
how that improves things. If you're still not seeing an improvement, then at that point you
Then
can
move
go
to it. Yeah.
just for an assessment, see what they have to say.
Mhm.
And I always try and reassure them that it's very quick, it's painless for them, and they can continue breastfeeding as soon as the procedure is finished.
Mhm.
The whole thing takes 3 minutes total,
Mhm.
so very, very quick and easy, and um, just to kind of help reassure them that it's okay because it's
Yeah.
a lot to take in when you're hearing it for the first time, for sure.
Absolutely. I know this can be a very intimidating conversation. And so Sarah is going to continue the conversation with us. We're going to talk about more things breastfeeding, but we're going to put a pin in this episode since we have covered all things tongue ties, which I'm so glad because so many women need to hear this information. So thank you, Sarah, for sharing this. Hang out. We're going to keep going. And thank you all for tuning in and being on this journey with us. As always, if you'd like to follow along outside the podcast, you can join the mission on Instagram at the Radiant Mission or on Facebook at the Radiant Mission Podcast. And of course, you can watch on YouTube too if you'd like. And if you are looking for Sarah, you can find her on Instagram at fortheloveoflactation_ or on her website, fortheloveoflactation.com. And Rachel is going to close us out.
Yeah, I'm going to close us today with my favorite breastfeeding Bible verse. Genesis 49:25. I actually just looked it up today. From the God of your father who helps you, and by the Almighty who blesses you with blessings of heaven above, blessings of the deep that lies beneath, blessings of the breasts and of the womb. And we're wishing you all a radiant week. Thanks for listening.